All right, so we have a huge treat for you guys. Folks who are watching on Twitter, get ready with your hashtags. This is going to be shocking for a conference like this. I'm about to introduce an all-white male panel. Right? That'll be a nice treat. So we're going to take a look. We had a lot of time yesterday talking about pipelines and talent and how do we make connections and mentorship. And we have two really great cases to take a look at that I think is going to put some meat on those issues and allow us to dig in. So please help me, please join me in welcoming two colleagues from Cincinnati, Trey DeVay and Peter Landgren, and a colleague from Houston, Mark Hansen. Please give them a good welcome. Keep it going, come on, they're almost there. Let's go, all right.
Thanks, Jamie. For the beginning of the all-white male presentation, that really sets us up perfectly for this SphinxCon, Jamie. Thanks.
It's my gift.
You really warmed up the crowd beautifully. We're really happy today to talk to you about really two great fellowships, and I think Trey's going to start out for us.
Yeah, Trey DeVay, president of the Cincinnati Symphony Orchestra. It's a real pleasure to be here today and talk about the initiative that we've developed in Cincinnati. And just to go back to yesterday's conversation where we talked about 2 to tango or 3 to tango, and want to begin by acknowledging that the seeds of this program were developed in 2011, and Peter will talk about that a little bit more. And we've had time to think about this and process, but it's now a reality for us. The program is underway, and just need to acknowledge the Mellon Foundation for being a tremendous partner, an essential partner in getting liftoff with this project. It's been financial support, of course, but moral support, intellectual support, and to Susan and Liz in particular, who I've seen. Thank you for that. So the issues in terms of the demographics of American orchestras are well known to this audience. The 4% African American and Latino makeup of orchestras is consistent with the Cincinnati Symphony Orchestra.
And I'm Peter Landgren, Dean of CCM, the College Conservatory of Music at the University of Cincinnati, and I'm also a proud alum of the school, and frankly the demographics, as you see in symphony orchestras. Yesterday we talked an awful lot about the pipeline, and those are slightly higher than what we see in the symphony orchestra world, but frankly what we are seeing is as students matriculate through undergraduate programs, that they are not persisting through graduate programs, and it really is those graduate programs that are going to hopefully really push all of our best musicians and frankly our most diverse musicians out into the world. And I think this CCM and the CSO have great partnerships that we're going to talk about, and we believe that we can be a great center for moving this forward.
So just very briefly, we feel like we're well positioned to add value to this conversation and provide really meaningful experiences in this fellowship program. The relationship between the CSO and CCM is incredibly strong, with faculty members that are comprised at CCM of CSO musicians and alumni that work for our orchestra both in administrative positions and on the stage. There are administrative connections that exist, board connections. I am on Peter's board. Peter is on my board. There's hardly a day goes by that we don't connect. There have been a series of initiatives that we have put together leading up to what we consider this pinnacle of a partnership project over recent years, and we don't need to get into the details other than to say a project of this magnitude requires two institutions to really come together in a very comprehensive and integrated way. And so we've got a running head start at getting to that point.
Yeah, and I think that ability to work together is frankly also our ability as individual organizations and collective organizations to work out in our community. And CCM, through our community engagement and our engagement partners, we're really working hard to build that pipeline. I want to make one shout out to, frankly, an alum of CCM, Duran Hall. I see him sitting there, who's now working in Memphis, who really began when he was a student, this core music project, working in a very underserved community in Avondale, which is right next to the University of Cincinnati. And previous to this work, we would drive through this neighborhood, and that was it. Now we've got this phenomenal program that is going on there.
When Peter and I first started talking about this work, we looked at the stages of engagement in engaging diverse candidates and musicians in the world of orchestras. And at every stage, we did an assessment of how well we're doing. So this begins with exposure, and through the orchestra and through Peter's efforts, but through the orchestra's efforts alone, over 80,000 young people are exposed to the music, to other initiatives like our Nouveau Chamber Players, which is focused on African American and Latino high school, primarily musicians. And you have to give a shout out to 2 of the 9 semifinalists for the junior division, who I think are here today, Miles Yazell and Matthew Adams, that came up.
Are they here? Yeah. Way to go, guys.
Stand up, come on,
there
come
they
on.
are.
So we're proud of Miles and Matthew because they've both been associated with programs through the Cincinnati Symphony Orchestra, and we're really pleased with their accomplishments. But would really focus in on the heart of the matter, which is when we looked at all of the work that we were doing, the void that was greatest, at least in Cincinnati, is around the pre-professional to professional bridge. So what are the training opportunities that we're providing to aspiring musicians to take that next step to a professional career? And CCM is an educational institution that has a performance element. We are a performance institution that does a great deal of work in education. And it was really bringing the assets of our 2 institutions together to say, how can we best add value to the next generation of musicians? And as we've joked, we can now finish each other's sentences. We're like an old married couple. And, but it's 2 organizations acting as one. That is the idea. And both of us have capabilities that we bring to the table.
And the way, frankly, through my personal story, I was able to activate this when I was a student at CCM, a French horn student, is that starting in my sophomore year, I was fortunate enough to start substituting with the Cincinnati Symphony. So I was taking the education that I was getting from our faculty on a daily basis, and then going down to Music Hall and playing with 100 phenomenal professionals. And truly, what this fellowship is that we have created, thanks to Susan and the Mellon Foundation, is that we will bring musicians to Cincinnati through this Bravos Without Barriers program. And what we are going to be doing is focusing on master's and artist diploma students, having them as full-time students. We're looking at 5 fellows at a time in the first year. We'll go through the whole sequence of it. So the fellows will have a community within themselves. They will be master's artist diploma students. They'll get mentoring with musicians in the CSO. They will be playing up to 5 weeks with the orchestra. We're looking for people who come from a broad range of diversity, and diversity, of course, with ethnic diversity, but also diversity having to do with first-generation college students, people who have grown up in adversity. We have got a lot of promise in what we're doing right now, and frankly, today at CCM is our 2nd audition day for 72 applicants who are looking at these 5 positions.
Peter mentioned the program. There are 5 weeks of performance activity with the Cincinnati Symphony Orchestra. And the idea is that these musicians would get advanced mentorship from a CSO-assigned mentor. So a couple weeks in advance of the program, the musician mentors would say, hey, if it were me, I would look at these sections in the music, watch, in particular, you have to pay attention to the conductor here, et cetera. This is how the performance style that we bring to this piece. Then throughout the week of rehearsals, they would be stand partners and can give regular mentorship throughout the week, and then after the performance, some post-performance evaluation. So that's really the idea during those performance weeks, and they would be progressive in nature. So we wouldn't have the musicians performing Messiaen Tarangalila on week 1, but we might phase into that over time.
And as we look at Bravos Without Barriers, is what are the barriers that we're trying to overcome here? One of them is, of course, cost. So we've provided, our university has provided full tuition scholarships. Mellon has helped us provide stipends. We will be putting mock auditions, all sorts of experiences together for our students. So right now in this 4-year program, this is marketing and audition year. We are identifying by April 15th 5 fellows who we hope will be 2 violins, viola, cello, bass. That first year will be in place next fall as we are recruiting our second year of fellows. We've been spending a lot of time getting the word out. This is a great way to get the word out, but we've spent many resources making sure that people know about this program. It's come through many different ways, and all orchestra of color that Trey has visited in England. We've been to this Color of Music Festival, which is in Charleston. We've really used our resources as much as we can. And this is the answer to the question, how did we do? We've gotten these numbers of people in these 4 instruments. Here's the demographics. And what we're very pleased with is that for graduate string students, these demographics are unprecedented at our school. So if we can replicate this year after year at CCM, if we can replicate this in other schools, we will move that needle. As students have self-identified through the application process, we've asked them a series of questions, and people can check any number of boxes in there. And as we've looked at our instrumentation through all of them, again, especially strings, so many of our students are coming from Asia these days, and we're overlooking our own country. And I think we've really been able to turn that around a great deal. So we are really right now poised to be looking at a very different group of people coming in for our auditions.
So just to wrap this up, the CCM auditions will conclude in the next handful of days, and those finalists then will audition for CSO musicians. There's quite a degree, as I mentioned earlier, of overlap between the faculty and our musicians. So some musicians will be hearing these candidates on multiple occasions. The auditions, while we, like most orchestras, have a blind audition process, for this particular program, there is not a screen involved, and so just relevant information to the program. And in conclusion, really, we've got a lot of oversight and engagement, intellectual partnership with the Mellon Foundation. The Sphinx is a partner and evaluator in this project. A series of discussions and convenings to help make sure that we get to the right answer. And lastly, we would just ask that each and every one of you, as you process this program that we've developed, please give us your feedback. We by no means feel that this is a finished product. We feel like we need to try, learn, and each of you we'd like to consider part of our focus group and advisors. So please let us know your thoughts.
Excellent. Thank you guys very much.
Thanks. Mr. Flicker, go get him. Good show.
Thank you, Trey. Thank you, Peter, for leaving me with 2.5 minutes. I appreciate that. Good morning, everybody. Great to see everyone, and I certainly want to thank Sphinx for inviting me to talk briefly about the Houston Symphony's community-embedded musician positions. I also want to recognize Pam Blaine, our Chief of Education and Community Programming, and Emily Nelson, one of her Chief Lieutenants, for being here with me. They have been instrumental not only in the launch of this program, but also the successful first year in which we find ourselves. And I expect that you all will have a question or two that will be better fielded by them. Yesterday and already today, we have heard mention about an audition issue and a pipeline issue. And the Houston Symphony hopes that our community-embedded musicians, both because of the selection process that we've designed and the type of work that these community-embedded musicians are doing, will help to address those two critical issues. As we were designing the program and as we are continually refining and expanding it and thinking about other strategies that are tied to our new strategic plan, we're being led by four questions that we're constantly asking ourselves. Firstly, how can the Houston Symphony become a magnet for musicians from underrepresented communities? How can the Houston Symphony leverage planned orchestra growth, both non-traditional and traditional full-time positions, to become more representative of our community? Through the work of our CEMs, can we inspire thousands of children in underrepresented communities to pursue musical training, and how will we support this pursuit on their part? And should the Houston Symphony consider adding off-stage community-embedded musician positions and or a fellowship program to further expand the candidate pool? We're thrilled with the number of diverse candidates, really talented candidates, who have applied for our first community-embedded musician positions, but we are wondering if we need to do more to expand the number of qualified candidates to join the Houston Symphony family that is in the midst of pursuing an ambitious 10-year vision to become America's most relevant and accessible top 10 orchestra by the year 2025. The Community Embedded Musician Program and their incredible work in schools and out in the community is in direct support of this ambitious plan. In addition to the community relevance goal, we are trying to grow our artistic performance, and a large part of that is by growing traditional and non-traditional positions that I'll detail in a second. All of this, of course, requires an investment on the part of the community, and already we have seen that over the last 5 years as our budget has grown from $23 million to $32 million, while we've maintained balanced budgets. And this plan, if fully implemented, will call for our operating budget to grow another 50% by the year 2025. I'm sure you all know that Houston is America's fourth largest and most diverse major city. You can see that the Latino population is over 40%, African American population just under 20%, the Caucasian population is dropping as a percentage of the whole, and there is a fast and growing Asian population as well. So an incredible mix, but we believe to be relevant and artistically vibrant and sustainable, the Houston Symphony has to achieve a more diverse orchestra, staff, and board. And we must be engaging this growing and diverse audience in new and exciting ways. So over the course of this 10-year period, not only will we be trying to fill the 8 current vacancies within our 87 full-time complement of onstage musicians, we will also be regrowing the traditional orchestra back up to 97 positions where we were under music director Christoph Eschenbach in the 1990s. In terms of non-traditional positions, we've already hired 4 community-embedded musicians who started in August, and we hope will spend as many years as they want as our full-time, ongoing community-embedded musicians. As we approach this spring and summer, we plan to hold an audition for at least 1 additional violinist to join these 4. If it turns out that we learn between now and the audition in the selection process that one of our current 4 has won a job, a traditional job, perhaps in the Cincinnati Symphony or in the Houston Symphony. We would obviously be looking for more than one community-embedded musician. There's unlimited growth potential because we aren't confined by space, for example. There's no reason in a city as large, as diverse, as ambitious, we couldn't have 30 or 40 community-embedded musicians complementing the fine work of our traditional onstage musicians. There is, of course, the question of how many community-embedded musicians can we continue to incorporate into on-stage work with our traditional musicians. And that's one of the reasons why we continue to ask the question, should we consider adding some off-stage community-embedded musicians? Because we will eventually run out of space when we have 97 full-time traditional musicians and X number of community-embedded musicians. The most important work that they're doing, we believe, is out in the community, and we could be doing even more if we get to a point where we don't have to ask all of our community-embedded musicians to pass that very, very high artistic bar that is part of the selection process. We're also exploring very seriously a fellowship program that would more immediately bring some underrepresented musicians onto the stage on a full-time basis. In terms of that musician growth, we're being guided by 2 questions. How can we effectively recruit a diverse pool of talented candidates from underrepresented communities? And how can we support these musicians and help position them success through the audition process? You'll hear me mention an audition workshop that we hope to have in place this spring to further propel diverse candidates for these open community-embedded musician positions that we'll be filling this spring. This is what our CEMs are doing as they're embedded in Houston schools, neighborhoods, healthcare settings, as teaching artists and as performers. The secondary but still very important role is to perform on stage with the orchestra. They are appearing with the Houston Symphony during 25 concerts this season, a wide variety of performances from our student concerts. It's important that these community-embedded musicians engage with children in individual classrooms and then can be spotted by these children as they enter Jones Hall. And I love seeing the waving back and forth from the audience chamber to their Houston Symphony community-embedded musician on stage. The positions are full-time and permanent. Starting salary of $40,000 plus an additional $10,000 or so that they are paid for those orchestra services per rates outlined in our CBA, and a full benefit package similar to exactly, actually, what the administrative staff receives in terms of parking, in terms of retirement benefit, in terms of health and dental. The program and the selection process were developed in close coordination with musician leadership. We wanted these positions, these new colleagues, to have the full support of the entire Houston Symphony family from day one. Early results indicate that our community-embedded musicians are inspiring many children to pursue music who might otherwise not have had this idea planted in their head, changing our organization's relationship with the community, but we're still in the infant stages of finding CEMs who reflect Houston's great diversity. This is what their involvement within the Houston Symphony organization is allowing us to do: 800 new community and education activities, in part through a year-long school residency at Crespo Elementary, a disadvantaged school that is part of the Houston Independent School District, residencies at 8 high school band and orchestra programs throughout the year, pre- and post-student concert classroom visits so that a vast majority of the 55,000 students who are coming for a full orchestra concert at Jones Hall have an opportunity to interact with an individual musician both before and after the full orchestra experience. Partnerships with many social service agencies, and a growing music and wellness initiative, both with hospitals and with music therapists in the area. We publicized the first community-embedded musician programs through mass market and targeted channels. We made sure to emphasize that we were looking for qualified candidates who could represent Houston's diversity within the Houston Symphony family, and we encouraged bilingual candidates to apply, because that, of course, is important in a community in which 90 languages are spoken. The selection process is multifaceted, includes an initial application, a Skype interview, and then an in-person component that resulted in 104 applicants submitting a resume, written essay responses, and a recording. Our principal string players then approved 40 of those applicants to advance to the next stage. The administrative team selected 29 of those 40 who had passed through that initial artistic screening for Skype interviews, during which we learned more about their education and community qualifications and passion. 21 of those 29 were then invited to come down to Houston at our expense for a couple days of in-person auditions and interviews. We were very pleased, and you can see on the screens to my left and right, with the diversity of the candidate pool, even though in the end we were disappointed that 5 Caucasians and 1 Palestinian, not obviously representative of Houston's diverse community, passed through the live musical audition that was behind a screen. That was, of course, very important to our musician audition committees. We were hoping, and will continue to have this hope, this dream for years to come, to be able to select CEMs who have not only passed through the Skype interviews, the recording selection phase, but the live audition, who truly represent Houston's diversity. And then through interactions with them in the interview setting, and by seeing them demonstrate their passion, their experiences in front of a classroom of kids, select the most qualified, best and most well-rounded musician ambassadors to serve in this very important role. In the end, we're incredibly proud of their work, but as you can see, we have work in front of us to ensure that a more diverse finalist group emerges in the end for the final selection. We hope, as I said earlier, to add at least 1 new CEM. We are refining our strategies for recruiting qualified musicians, especially from underrepresented communities, for both the traditional and the non-traditional positions available at the Houston Symphony. We're developing this audition workshop program that will give top candidates who have heard about this program the opportunity to advance their skill set in advance of the screened audition that is a part of the CEM selection process. And then, as I said earlier, we are exploring the idea of these offstage CEMs that would perhaps have a recorded portion of the selection process, but not a live audition, because the expectation would not be to have them perform as a substitute member of the Houston Symphony, because the quantity of community education work makes that problematic. And then we're also thinking about a fellowship program that would only be open to musicians from underrepresented communities, to more quickly get to a point where the face of the Houston Symphony on stage better reflects Houston's diversity. This is what has already been the collective impact: a greater number and variety of new, attractive, meaningful employment opportunities at the Houston Symphony for musicians who have this passion to do more than just perform as part of a full professional ensemble. We're changing the makeup of the orchestra, though are not satisfied with the amount of interest that we have attracted thus far from underrepresented communities. And we believe we're improving that pipeline of qualified musicians through the work of our community-embedded musicians. I will pass things back to you,
Great, thank you
Jamie.
very much.
Good job, Mark.
All right. So we've got a lot, and we've got, what, 15 minutes for this, I think? So we're going to try and get through as much as possible. And sort of where I'd like to begin is yesterday when Doug from the Stewart Foundation was talking about sort of for-profit, not-for-profit, right? We need to rename the sector. And in the for-profit sector, we know what the sector is for, right? It's for profit. And if you don't make profit, you're out, right? CEO is fired, the business is closed down, you're spun off. There's sort of instant accountability. So Doug suggested we become for social impact sector, something like that. What is the accountability we need to build in, right? We've been doing blind auditions in the orchestral world for how long? Because we know that that is going to change the makeup of our orchestras. It's worked on gender, it hasn't worked on race and ethnicity. When are we going to admit that isn't working and we need to do something different? You set up a diversity fellowship program that resulted in 85% Caucasian musicians being brought in. You're being very thoughtful, you're taking a look at this. What is the accountability we need to add? What should we look at for this, at what point should we say, you, Mr. CEO of the Cincinnati Symphony, have been working on this for how long? The numbers haven't moved at all. How do we get accountability? Where do we do that? How do we attach that to the sector so we don't just keep saying, we're doing our best, soon, trust us?
Right. And I think as an industry, we also have to get more comfortable challenging the status quo and the sacred cows that have been problematic up until this point. So we challenged our traditional tenure track and tenured musicians at the bargaining table, both in 2010 and 2014, to allow more flexibility to get built into the contract. We gained a little bit, but we were constantly reminded that no, they've been hired to be orchestral musicians. By having that uncomfortable and somewhat productive conversation at the bargaining table, we were then in a position after the strategic plan that had massive amounts of musician involvement to go back to orchestra leadership and say, we need you to help design this new, non-traditional position that will complement the traditional work of a symphony orchestra, because there's no way we can satisfy the requirements of this ambitious strategic plan without doing new things, without expanding the pool of qualified, talented, committed musicians, traditional and non-traditional, working in pursuit of this shared vision. And so I hold myself accountable, yes, partly by the performance of the orchestra on stage. We are certainly pursuing artistic excellence and artistic impact, but I think within our community, it's more important for me and the administration and the board and our musicians to be held accountable based on what we are doing out in the community. So we've doubled the number of free community concerts to 25 a year. We're being careful about pricing decisions. We've established diversity councils because we know we don't have all of the answers. And in the end, I think if we are demonstrating a willingness and an ability to pursue a wide range and a large quantity of efforts, the outcome, while vitally important, is still unknown. And we're not going to necessarily know the type of outcome that we should be shooting for until we've tried scores of new ideas, new initiatives, new efforts to engage a larger segment of our city's population in the life of the Houston Symphony.
Trey.
Well, I would just add to that governance is critical. And I think the mission statement or the vision of the Detroit Symphony yesterday, Houston, and our vision statement are comparable in that this is baked into what we are aspiring to be in the future. And that's not how it always was. You used to read mission statements of orchestras, and it was artistic excellence first and foremost, underline it 3 times, and then move on. And artistic excellence is essential in terms of engaging our audiences and community. but there are other elements to engagement, and so governance is key to this, and perhaps this is false optimism, but when I got into the field 20 years ago, and we didn't quite overlap at the New York Philharmonic, but I do recall at those times that the Americanizing the American Symphony report that came out from the League, that study, which included a focus on diversity, was headed straight for the shelf to collect dust. And I felt like the leadership in our industry was not interested, ready, engaged to take on that in a meaningful way. Now, with the emergence of Sphinx, with partners like Mellon that are putting this front and center, the conversations that happen today on this matter are far more in depth, far more serious than I ever felt 20 years ago. So now the trick is 20 years from now, we cannot be looking at the same outcome.
So let me just pick up the governance piece, and then we'll come to you, Peter. But you talked about governance. I'm asking about accountability. This is now in the mission statement of the Cincinnati Orchestra. You presumably are hired and fired by your board of directors, yes? Is this part of your annual performance review? Does the board hold you accountable explicitly on this?
So my performance review, we have typically 9 or so organizational objectives for the year, and 3 of those, 2 or 3, are what we consider make or break objectives. Within those 3 make or break objectives, one of them is focused on a number of matters that include initiatives, efforts like this. So yes, every year I am evaluated on this. Every year, whether it's our Multicultural Awareness Council, our Diversity and Inclusion Committee, weigh in to assess how are we doing as an institution. When we've got Miles and Matthew succeeding, and projects like we're initiating, we don't know how it's the success of the Diversity Fellowship Program, but we feel like we're pointed in the right direction.
Let me just broaden the lens for a second with a sort of aesthetic question. There's artistic excellence, and there are community-embedded musicians. And people are maybe good enough to be in one, but not good enough to be in the other, right? There's a dichotomy. You can't be artistically excellent and work in community. Is that correct?
And let's dig into that.
No, that's not
Jamie.
correct.
Push back, right? I want to be disagreed with.
I disagree with you, because what are we bringing those musicians in to do into an orchestra, and besides changing the face of how that orchestra looks? When I was hired by the Cincinnati Symphony to play as a substitute when I was a sophomore, they were not saying that I'm of the caliber to be a full-time musician for life and tenured. That's not why they were bringing me on there. And yet, because I did that for 2 years, my talent grew to the point that I got a principal job in the Baltimore Symphony before I graduated. So that's the purpose of something like this. And when we look at excellence, our mission statement at CCM is uncompromising excellence. But when we look at uncompromising excellence, that means that we will be excellent in everything that we do, including our diversity initiatives. And I am, talk about accountability as a dean, I'm evaluated annually and by my provost, my boss, and diversity is one of the 6 or 7 things that I was evaluated on. When I went up for reappointment last year for my 2nd term, which is akin to a year-long strip search of your profession,
Thank you for that visual.
We can move on from that, I'm sure. But diversity was a big part of that, and frankly, at universities, we're pumping millions of dollars into diversity initiatives. I've made some fantastic hires of diverse faculty and staff, and that's again a partnership between a university and a college who's saying this is important. And going back to my freshman year in Cincinnati in 1975, when I got there and started going to concerts at Music Hall, there was one African-American musician on that stage, Norman Johns, a fantastic cellist. I come back here in 2011, And Trey and I start these conversations literally at a time when we couldn't finish each other's sentences and we were just getting to know each other. There's one African-American musician in the Cincinnati Symphony, Norman Johns, a cellist. So what has been done on an intentional basis by leadership, by education, by orchestras that's moved that needle? So our first conversation, which was our level of accountability, was we need to build something that's intentional. And so I think what Mark has done with Houston is an intentionality behind how we're going to address this. What Trey and I and our two organizations have said is this is a priority for us. Mellon has partnered with us, and so now we've got a three-legged stool instead of a two-legged stool. And so we don't have to lean against each other quite as much thanks to that third leg.
I think you want to jump in and just, we probably have time for one or two quick questions if anyone wants to get to either mic or raise their hand, and we have something coming in from Twitter.
Just a quick comment. I don't believe that American Orchestras, in partnership with the National Musicians Union, has done a very good job of making musician positions within our organizations attractive enough. And so we shouldn't be surprised with the current outcome. Most of our orchestras have fewer musician positions today than 20 years ago. And we have not had the frank conversations within organizations and as an industry about ways to expand the job description, expand the selection process. We in Houston aren't having the success with respect to the traditional position yet, but I hope that the non-traditional position, accessed through a non-traditional selection process that allows us to look at the whole being of candidates, will over time influence how we think about traditional selection processes within our institution.
And I think the union conversation is a big one that I hope next year we can get some folks. Let's take one question from Twitter and then we'll do 4 lightning round comments questions.
All right, I am running the Twitter feedback here. This is a question for Mark. We've seen the language traditional and non-traditional come up a lot in your discussion so far, and there's concern from the Twitter audience that maybe that language isn't the most helpful in the context of the actual statistics around diversity in Houston. There's concern that maybe that language creates a first-class and a second-class citizen type of issue when you're looking at that. I'm wondering if you would speak from the heart. I mean, now that we've seen all these wonderful statistics, if you would speak from your heart about how you guys strive to frame the conversation and how you choose your language as you're creating these positions to create positions and language in the community that's truly helpful for advancing these values.
We may not be using the right vocabulary, but when speaking to a sophisticated crowd like today, we have found it helpful to use traditional versus non-traditional or on-stage versus community-embedded musician titles. But it's something that we've certainly struggled with. And in the end, we want all of our musicians, whether they are community-embedded musicians or tenured or tenure-track musicians that are governed by the CBA, to be viewed, to be celebrated by the community as Houston Symphony musicians. And so we do not go out of our way to describe this distinction out in the community, because what we're looking for more than anything else is their collective impact. We also wanted to ensure that our community-embedded musicians would have the respect of every traditional Houston Symphony musician, staff member, board member, by retaining this high artistic bar.
Great. So I'm going to take these two, Desi, if it's all right, I'm going to ask you if you and I can connect later, and I'll get your voice in on the conversation.
Yeah, mine is a voice that, it's not my question, it's from...
Okay, just give me 30 seconds. I'm going to give you guys the mic, and then we're going to have closing comments here, and then we'll get everyone in, I promise.
Hi, my name is Jania Stigall. I work in education for the Baltimore Symphony. I actually was a graduate at CCM. My very first internship ever was at the CSO. Woohoo! Go Bearcats. So I did have a question. I had a similar diversity fellowship while I was in school, and I remember that there was an effort from the orchestra to have the orchestra look more like the community, but when I was performing, I would look out, and the audience didn't look like the community. I was wondering if there were any similarly strategic efforts to also diversify audiences for these fellows.
Great. Audience, we're going to stack these questions right behind you. Let's go here, and then I'll come over to Desi.
I'm Mary Ann Scialino from Scialino Artist Management. I want to give a management perspective on this. I represent Harlem Quartet, Brazil Guitar Duo, Elena Urioste, Juan Miguel Hernandez, and others. I'm in a rut, so I'm asking you guys for advice. Okay, I get on the phone all the time. I'm on the dark side of things, okay? And I get on the phone and I say, you know what? All of my artists do community engagement, and they're dedicated to working within the communities where they perform. But I feel like I'm in a rut. What more can I and my agent manager colleagues be doing to communicate better with the orchestras so that when we quote unquote pitch our artists, how can we expand our offerings to you folks? So I'm coming to you for advice.
Fantastic. Desi, 30 seconds.
Okay, good. My question. So yesterday, Paul Hogle said, are we climbing the wrong tree, right? That's what he said. And Jamie Bennett, in the conversation that we had, said, no, not particularly in this. We were talking about something else. We need this and this, right? Still with me. And so we do need the symphony orchestras, but the mainstream orchestras, but we also need the soulful symphonies. Like we're talking about diversity, but we never talked about Darren Atwater, who has a soulful symphony. So the answer to that is we need the mainstream orchestras because the DeVos Institute came out with the report, like our Fracture Atlas friend, I didn't get his name, that said once the funders, so the question's coming, once the funders fund, what usually happens is 90% of the funding will go to a mainstream organization the minute we start looking at diversity to help their diversity efforts, but it becomes, how about the funding of the soulful symphony that can give, like if I'm giving them $5, am I also giving a soulful symphony and that we're Atwater? Am I also at least giving him $3?
Got it.
Or, so then we go there, and then we have, maybe we need that, but diversity efforts, because we're not climbing the wrong mountain, we need to look at other ways to climb it, like a James Rose could help create a soulful symphony here in Detroit, so that we go back to Jamie, so we have this and this. So we do need the diversity efforts of the Cincinnati to Houston. We do need that. We don't start that. But as funders, it's like Chris Daggett said, we have to take the risk and put our money behind the risk of helping the Soulful Symphony so that they can have the millions of dollars in advertising and help with the face to build that, to embed that so it can be replicated. So the question is, because it is a question, because I'm listening, I'm listening because when you go back to dinner, you have the real conversations. So I'm listening to the real conversations. So are we taking the risk? And wait a minute, here was the question right here. What are we doing, like they just said, Peter Langen, on an intentional basis at every level from the funders? Look at that DeVos Institute, like that was getting ready to go collect dust. And everyone in this room, you ask yourself, what are we doing on an intentional basis to increase diversity on every level so that we also have the mainstream, but we're helping. We don't give 90% of the funding to the mainstream and only 10% to the non-traditional. Let's balance that, and I don't want to take money out of anybody's pocket because I don't believe that. You know what I mean? What you eat is what you eat.
All right. So we're going to do the respond if you want to respond. All right. So we're going to do this super quick because I've already been given notes about bringing things in on time. We heard a question about audience, which hasn't really come up yet. We're talking about administrators, we're talking about artists, we haven't really talked about audience. I've heard someone say there isn't a pipeline problem. She's got musicians that she's been pitching for 40 years and no one's listening. So how do we connect to the resources that exist? And I heard a really great question here about if the symphony orchestra, which is a very expensive proposition, is eating up this much of the philanthropic pie, what responsibility do we have to enable others, to make room for others, to give over resources for others? So think about those questions. Think about the theme for our conference, which is ACT, right? We want people to go home and do something different. 30 seconds, what do you want people to leave here knowing?
Well, I think to tie all those points together, I think we should aim for an overwhelming infusion of committed experimentation. Because if we experiment at each of these stages, and if it's committed, not just for the short term, but really stay engaged, and if it doesn't work, let's come back at it.
I would say from our manager on the dark side, look at schools like CCM and others who would, they're not symphony orchestras, but we're bringing in Sphinx Virtuosi next year to really help enhance our diversity efforts. It's a major fundraising priority for our school to be able to afford this, but we're doing it because it helps us tell the complete story. The other thing that I would say is I've got collegiate students and faculty who want support and scholarship and all of that, and yet we're putting an intentional priority on our pipeline because we're not going to have an audience. We're not going to have collegiate students if we don't have high school students and middle school students and preschool students who are involved and aware of the creative arts.
How many presenters do we have in the room? Are there presenters in the room?
I've run out of business cards, sorry.
Excellent, all right, excellent. Bring us home. Last thing you want folks to walk away from this panel discussion with.
I constantly think about a virtuous circle that reminds me that this is all interconnected. To be relevant to all Houstonians, we need a symphony orchestra family that is representative of our city's diversity. To attract musicians, board members, staff members from underrepresented communities, to attract the most civically minded, socially minded musicians, administrators, and staff, we need an audience. We need a board that also reflects the community. The arrival of the Houston Symphony's first ever Hispanic music director, Andres Orozco Estrada, is a huge, huge opportunity for us. And we already are being told by Kate Prescott, who is organizing a top orchestra ongoing survey, that the Houston Symphony's audience is one of the youngest and most diverse. And I hope that and believe that those early indicators of an organization becoming more relevant, more impactful, will create this virtuous circle and help us to gain more momentum in terms of recruitment efforts.
That's great. All right, one bit of housekeeping, then we'll thank them. Let's try and take a 6-minute break so that we can try and get back on schedule. So go super fast. So give me a quick round of applause for these guys, and we'll see you in 6 minutes.